Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us. We're a little bit late, but here we are for this School of Transnational Governance lecture, the Florence series, Florence Live. And we're going to be talking today. I'm Tariq Pandya from the New York Times. And after a whirlwind week for European football last week, we're going to try and digest what happened with the breakaway Super League that quite wasn't. Perhaps one of the biggest stories in European football for decades, but one that had a very short life. We've got a great panel for you today. We have former footballers, governance experts, and lawyers. I'll let the guests introduce themselves one by one. Aki, would you like to kick off?
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Former very average football player in the, in Bundesliga, Premier League, Champions League, and 69 caps for my home country, Finland. After that, I've been the CEO for the biggest club in Finland, HJK Helsinki. I'm UEFA Club Competitions Committee Vice Chairman and ECA, European Club Association's Vice Chairman. So I was very much, last week was a very busy week, let's put it this way.
Roberta?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. So I am just an avid football fan, but I'm the mother of 4 boys. So last week, even though it was only part of my work, that meant that in the evening was one of the most interesting dinner conversations we've had on this now hopefully defunct idea of the European Super League.
And Miguel, all I know about you is that you're a sporting fan. And any other career highlights you'd like to share with everyone?
I think that's the highest highlight. Aside from being a very promising young player whose career was cut short by studies, I'm a law professor and the professor of governance at the School of Transnational Governance of the UI, precisely. But I've also been an advocate general at the Court of Justice of the European Union, a Portuguese minister, and my only more intense dealing with the world of football. I was, for a brief period of 9 months, the chair of the governance committee of FIFA, what gave me particular insights to the world of football in a particularly interesting moment.
And just a message, a note for the audience here. You can participate yourselves by sending in questions to this Florence Live series and the discussion today. But just to go back on topic, this perhaps honestly was the most significant week I've worked on. The last time I can remember a story moving this fast. Maybe some of you remember a bunch of FIFA executives were sort of dragged from their hotel rooms at 6 o'clock in the morning in May 2015, and it was just hour after hour the developments. I haven't seen something as significant or as fast moving as what happened last week in my professional life. But it throws up a lot of questions, big questions: the future of football, private leagues, distribution of the game's riches. Are the big clubs too big? Should they just go away? The governance of football. What is the role of FIFA and UEFA? Are they fit for purpose? And the role of people like Roberta, and we're expecting another guest here, Damien Collins, a lawmaker, a parliamentarian from the United Kingdom. What is the role of transnational and national governments? Football has been moving in the direction of more and more commercialization for the last 2 or 3 decades. There have been no safeguards really to prevent this. We've seen a fan uprising. Millions of people seem to be exercised what happened last week. So there is a social dimension to football, which perhaps the politicians, people outside of football, need to address. But let me start by asking each of our guests a question. Aki, you had a front row seat last week. I understand you're one of the first people who had a real inkling because of your position on the European Club Association board. When you found out, what was your reaction?
I think I thought I had a first row place because I was on Friday in both ECA board and UEFA Club Competitions Committee. We unanimously agreed about the post-24 reforms, and then little I knew, because on Sunday I wake up from the the news and messages that everything was done behind our back and my back, in ECA's back, that some other individuals had their own agenda, which was not known to us. And you are right, Tariq, because this every time that there's a new cycle or there's a new different stakeholders are about to talk about new contracts between each other, this threat of private league, super league always comes up. And we never thought it was reality, especially now. We never thought it was, apart from probably Real Madrid, we never thought that nobody would be serious about it. So we were absolutely blown away. And after that, as you can see from my eye bags, I have not slept since. So it was huge, and it will change the game. There was a lot of things that needs to be agreed now, and there's a lot of issues that are still unsolved, even though this was. So the story doesn't end here, but I agree with you, it changed everything, and the response from the football world was huge. But we also have to be careful not to interpret everything too much to one direction or the other direction. It's more complex than we think.
So a moment for diplomacy, but perhaps a moment for Europe's politicians to finally stand up. Roberta, do you think this has focused the minds? You are a very senior parliamentarian at the European Union. The conversations you've been having, is it time for you guys to get involved finally?
I think in all my times, in all the years I've been a member of the European Parliament, never has a subject brought everybody together so quickly and more or less along the same lines. And that was quite impressive. You had people from the extreme left to the extreme right saying, what is this? It's a complete disrespect of fans, our communities, everybody mentioning the teams they have supported, and the basic anger that you felt was not something I had seen, and not so unanimously. But there was also a question of what can we do? So of course, if this had actually become a reality, or we would be having a different kind of conversation today, we would be in the plenary, which is about to start, when all the parliamentarians get together, we would be discussing this point, and we would be saying, what can Europe do? I think we have seen different prime ministers, leaders saying, look, we need to change our legislation, change ownership structure of teams, need to see how many things are done, let's say, behind people's backs, understanding what Akita said in a moment ago. But there was also a set of reflection. Would we do something, or would it better be done at a national level? Can we do something? There was a similar story in 2017 with ice skating. And there you could see what the European Court said, and yes, there was a breach of treaty when there was a decision to ban these skaters from playing in another league. So on these matters, we would have, and we will have to actually go through all the debates, say, yes, we have a culture, we respect values, this is where sports come in, and we need to make sure we defend it. But would a top-down heavy decision actually solve this problem, or another Super League coming up in another sport going further? So this was the biggest question after the emotional anger, after the let's have a debate, let's stop, because in the European Parliament we talk a lot. What can we do? And the last thing we would have wanted is to have a legal, stretched out battle, which in the end would have, solved nothing. So this was, I think, what I could sense last week. Like, will the European Union do something? Can we do it, or can it be done also at the national level?
Miguel, you've been thinking a lot about the what can we do before this. Just a little background. Miguel was on the FIFA governance committee for a very short-lived period. Miguel will speak for himself, but Miguel lasted for about 9 to 11 months or something like this, only because he did his job. Unfortunately, when you are within some of these structures, the level of politics is so intense that some decisions simply are unpalatable for government. So within football's government, Miguel, what have you learned from what you knew then, your own experience, to what you saw happen in this catastrophic sort of launch and collapse in the last week? What have you seen put these two things together?
Well, as you know, through my own experience, but not only my own, of other people that were with me at the governance committee of FIFA following precisely the reforms that were taken after the corruption scandals and the creation of this governance committee, which I chair, that was supposed to monitor and implement some of these reforms. We lasted for a very short period of time. I left. I was forced to leave in my case. Then several of my colleagues left too, such as Navi Pillai, the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, Joseph Weiler, and we wrote at the time a piece where we argued that reform won't happen from within in football. And the reason is because there is a systemic conflict at the heart of football organizations, whereby those that are supposed to enforce the rules and guarantee the independent application of the rules, as it was our case, basically depend on those that are supposed to be scrutinized by and subject to these rules. So basically, I mean, as you know, in our case, we included some very famous people, including the Vice Prime Minister of Russia at the time from football, and that basically led us to leave. And that is actually a good example. When we took that decision, one of the things one of the reasons there was so much pressure by the President of FIFA and Secretary General of FIFA at the time was they were arguing you cannot exclude. The question was not whether he had or not violating the rules. The question was you cannot exclude it because we will have the World Cup in less than a year, and we have not negotiated the broadcasting rights, and this will have an impact on the economics of the World Cup. This tells us what? This tells us that there is an imminent conflict of interest within FIFA, but it happens also at UEFA. That's the reason, in my view, why UEFA acted so that Manchester City will not be subject to 2 years ban from the Champions League. Why? Because they are at the same time the regulators supposed to be regulating and ensuring the independent and equal application of the rules, and at the same time the economic organizers of the event. So they undermine the action of the independent committees because they think that they cannot afford, as the event organizer, to lose Manchester City from 2 years, or in the case of FIFA, they could not afford the conflict with the country where the event was organizing. Now, this highlights to me that independently from the question of the Super League, there is a need for a much broader regulation. And what me and my colleagues were arguing at the time is this regulation can only effectively come from the European Union. Individual states have no capacity of enforcing the rules that are of transnational organizations, none at all. And this, we're not talking about sports, we're talking about the economic activity that is linked to sports. And we're talking about, in the context of the European Union, of 3.7% of the European Union GDP, according to the study of the European Commission.
Right.
Can I just say, because I think Miguel and Roberta both touched a few points that is crucial, because I think it's fair to say that this was not only about money, but it was also about control, exactly for the reasons that was stated here. And to Roberta's point, I mean, there is one thing that which would, because most of the clubs, even though the industry has been growing, it's around 20 billion yearly in Europe for the top flight. And it's growing 10% a year, but 60 to 70% goes to players' wages and agents. So introducing some sort of salary gaps would for sure make the economy more sustainable. If that's possible, I think we will not see this kind of breakaways, because it's sustainable, and we are in a sustainable environment, which is also fair for the whole ecosystem. So that would help a lot. But I'm not sure if there is a willingness from that or from the players and agents to do this.
Roberta, Aki makes an excellent point. He's saying that there isn't willingness from players or agents to do it, but there also, the clubs don't seem to trust each other. There seems to be a if we let's pay the money, because if we don't, they'll pay it. It seems that it has to be done externally. So why is it so difficult? Can you explain, maybe from a legal or practical European Union level, why what Aki is saying, what seems suitable? I mean, you hear the big clubs saying this as well. We need to cut our wages, cut our salary. We need to get to 55% revenue maximum in terms of how much we spend on transfers, but they're spending 70%. And if you look at Barcelona, if things keep going the way they are, the trends, they'll be spending 104% of it. And Barcelona makes nearly €1 billion, and all of that money is leaving the club. You can call it mismanagement, but that is, they can't control themselves. So why can't you do that for them?
Exactly, Tarek, because at the moment, even though the industry is growing, it's not that, owners and clubs are making money. The only ones in the industry that is making money is players and agents at the moment.
Right. Roberto, could you address that, please?
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance that would need to be sought. And Miguel, I also got your point in terms of, how to save the clubs from themselves in a way. How are we going to make sure that we are not blamed from a European level of over-imposing or interfering into something that could be done at a lower level? So let's imagine we can do that. And that's a question, right? Because the European Court has in the past said that measures, including in sport, need to be proportionate. And therefore, that means that what Aki just said in terms of the amounts, yes, and if it's a disproportionate act, then you can target it. It has, we have inserted, let's say, through the Bosman ruling, rules on transfers, right? That was something that had to be done from the European level. As to whether you can, let's say, cap salaries, that is not something that has been done in any other areas, right? This is something that is, let's say, very much left to national authorities. But as Miguel said before, these are not national authorities, these are transnational. How is the ownership? Where are these players based, fiscal-wise? How are the company? How are the clubs organized? So, for example, if you have in some countries where the clubs have to have a minimum number of fans or community leaders as their shareholders, as opposed to clubs having one private person as an owner. In that sense, then there is no control. So where do we find the balance? And I understand, and I realize I'm not directly answering your question, but where do you find the balance between saying, look, can we do it? Should we do it? If there is political will, how much control do we want to exert? How much do we want individuals that we, from a European level, want to control their life?
Roberta, let me ask you though, just to get right, you, Roberta Metsola, do you want to do it?
I would like to see a complete restructuring of how these leagues and how the club's ownership works. That's what I would like to see. Whether I would like to cap people's salaries, I would not go as far as saying that, because I don't think that would be my, let's say, it's not about what I want. It's neither my responsibility or neither my obligation to do that. I understand that clubs are telling us, look, we have to emerge from this pandemic. We have to see how to do it. Financially, we're under massive pressure. That we have to also take into account. And my answer for that would be, let's use, if anything, this Recovery and Resilience Fund to help some communities that depend on the local clubs in order to try to survive. So I would rather look at it from a big picture rather than say, okay, I'm going to punish Mr. A or Mr. B just because I think he earns too much.
Just before I come back to you, Miguel, welcome Damien Collins, a lawmaker from the United Kingdom who's been a staunch proponent of governance reforms for football and sport for many years. Damien probably saw a lot of this coming, I would have thought. We wonder how much change there'll be. Welcome, Damien. Thank you for joining us. Miguel, you wanted to make a point off the back of what Roberta was saying there.
Yes, I was going to say that Roberta was telling you that there's a balance that needs to be made between the level of regulation that should be imposed without going into details, and what exactly is the appropriate role of regulators or the legislator, if you want the political process with regard to football. And my argument is that what is needed, and at the moment, and this made it clear, is on the one hand, you don't need to, and regulators should not get into the details of regulating football, not at all. But they should do a few things that, in my view, are crucial, and that this has made even patently more obviously necessary. First, I think that it is acceptable to recognize and even empower to authorities such as UEFA in terms of licensing organizations, but on the other hand, to establish principles that this licensing needs to comply. Let's say, okay, we recognize that the UEFA has the current monopoly, and we will basically accept that monopoly and prevent runaway leagues such as the Super League. But in turn, your licensing needs to respect these principles. For example, competitions need to have redistributive and solidarity clauses, need to be open, all these kinds of things. That's something that the legislator can do. Second fundamental thing, in my view, is that the legislator needs to impose a very strict division between the regulatory and the competition economic operator roles of these organizations such as the UEFA. Otherwise, this will create a conflict. If we don't do this, what will happen is that it will be the sports organizations themselves that will create the next Super League. I mean, no one has talked about that. The person before this, the person that 1 year ago said the sentence, I think we should create a league, and it's a closed league with the 20 best clubs, was not Mr. Fiorentino Perez, was not a chairperson of a British football club. It was Mr. Gianni Infantino. Mm-hmm. The president of FIFA has been arguing for a closed Super League of 20 clubs in Africa. And this shows you that what was at stake from the point of view of FIFA with the Super League was not the idea of a Super League. It was the fact that it was not them to promote and control the Super League. Mm-hmm. So it is important that the regulators intervene to prevent, and this is so because of this conflict of interest between being regulators on the one hand and the event organizers, the economic operators. So the regulator needs to intervene, to even if allowing them to continue to do the two functions, to impose strict separation between the two. And final point that I think it's necessary and is linked with this one is minimum standards of good governance in these organizations. Ethics controls, that their judicial bodies need to be genuinely independent. And that independence needs to be protected, that the democratic and free character of their elections needs to be respected, that women are not discriminated. There's a very recent case, as Tariqa know, that demonstrates the extent to which women are discriminated in these football organizations. These are all areas where the legislator has a role to play, and it should play this role.
That's a nice panorama there. In short, a total mess. Damien, you've been sounding the alarm for years. So can you describe your reaction to briefly what happened on Sunday? Did you see it coming?
I don't think it shouldn't have really been a surprise. I mean, in England earlier last year, there had been the leak of Project Big Picture, which had called for a big shake-up of English football, giving the big six clubs a much more powerful role in setting the rules for the Premier League and the Football League. And they demanded substantial reform of the structure of football in return for giving more money in solidarity payments. And in order to stop this and to stop the idea of the Big Six leaving the Premier League had agreed to a further review of its rules as well. So this pressure has been there, and I think it comes in part from some of these clubs who their long-term aim is the establishment of sort of franchise-based leagues, which make the clubs then overnight much more valuable because they have guaranteed income. They don't have to worry about not qualifying for the Champions League or not having a good cup run. They've got a certain amount of money which is set, and I think we have to recognise that's not going to go away. It could be proposed through the governing bodies, or a similar proposal in another form that may come forward. And I think we have to think now. Super League was headed off. I think probably that those clubs underestimated how much the fans care about the domestic leagues in that regard, and how important it is to Liverpool fans that they play Everton, not just play Real Madrid. That's probably more important that they play their local fixtures. And so they may have underestimated that. But the commercial imperatives to do something like this again, I think will come back. So I think what government has to think about is what do we do in order to put frameworks in place that make the creation of new competitions, that create rules around the creations of new competitions that make it hard for those competitions to be used to either exert market dominance by a small number of clubs over the rest of rest of football, and to undermine the idea of open and fair competition. I mean, the concerns we've raised in the past about football and the way football is run, and I think I certainly say look at this from the England perspective, is that we've allowed a system to develop over the years where football is really run by the collective decisions of the chairmen and women of clubs. In England, the most dominant commercial format is the Premier League. You have this something which is quite unusual compared to other sports, which is a single competition format. Is wealthier than the national governing body. Mm-hmm. Has more power in the national governing body, and its decisions are made by the commercial interests collectively of the chairs of those clubs. There is very little power of intervention, and even in the English Football League, 3 divisions below that, again, decisions are made by the collective decisions of 72 clubs acting together, and really the FA is excluded. So if we're concerned about the long-term financial sustainability of clubs, where the clubs are being run within the rules of the leagues that they operate within, to understand the finances of those clubs better, to make sure they're not doing things that are either jeopardizing the sustainability of the club or breaking financial fair play rules. Who is the body that enforces that? Well, at the moment, it is largely the leagues themselves. So it's largely the chairs of the clubs investigating themselves, and that is totally inadequate set of circumstances. Which body guarantees the integrity of competitions? The management of the calendar. I think looking at cricket in the IPL, I think is an interesting thing to look at in comparison. You can have a new competition set up that is not necessarily competing with other things, but can have a market distorting effect by pulling players and resources towards it and away from other things as well. So in the case of football, who is going to make those decisions? And I think it all rests back really on the question of who really owns football.
Well, that's a very good question about what football is as well, right? We have it being called an economic good, but we haven't talked about its social kind of imperative. You saw millions of people kind of exercise around the world. Aki, you wanted to make a intervention.
Yeah. Just a few comments, because if we look the football world now, because I understand your point, but at the moment we are also in a situation that the football world and the pyramid is fixed for the needs of a certain, which in this case is the 5 biggest leagues. The 5 biggest leagues, the whole other football European pyramid is fixed for that needs, because and the reason is that they joint TV broadcasting revenues is 6.65 billion, which is 8 times more than the 50 countries together, and they have the automatic spots in the Champions League and all the other leagues. So whatever we do in the 50 other countries at the moment is just feeding for those 5 big leagues. Obviously, Super League would have been one step even further in the needs for 12 biggest clubs. But at the moment, if I may say so, it's also a difficult situation. And what we talk about here now is a Super League and Champions League reforms, and we say no. But what we forgot to say at the moment is that actually the reform that UEFA is now producing together with us clubs, it's fantastic for 50 other countries. What happens in Europa League, Europa Conference League, solidarity payments, participation, all that for 50 countries, it's a game changer in many of us, especially in the lower end. We will have actually a role in this game, which we don't actually have now. So when we talk about Super League and Champions League reformers, let's don't forget that there are 50 other countries also than Big 5 that football is played. And we also have to acknowledge that, we need the whole football pyramid, this to be the biggest sport in the world, and this is forgotten in this whole discussions about the Super League and Champions League reform.
That's a good point, but Roberta, Aki says these 50 leagues and teams and national associations will benefit more, but to be devil's advocate, those teams who wanted to sweep away all of this tradition said, well, look, we could count however many billion fans in the world who are only focused on us 12. What about our private interests? Could this, if they tested this we saw a court case in Madrid, I believe, on Monday that ruled in their favor. It would have been interesting to see how that would have played out. Legally, do they have standing, do you think? Is UEFA a monopoly and they should be allowed to do what they want?
I mean, my hesitation to saying what needs to be done is precisely my answer as a lawyer, right? So I have been trying to get my head around into saying what can be done. if we go beyond the changes that even Miguel listed. I mean, with those changes that you listed, Miguel, with regard to the disparity that exists, the minimum standards that are not observed, the fact that the licensing structure is not clear. If we had to target that, at least there would already be, I think, we would have already done much more than we were at least politically willing to do a week ago when we woke up to this situation from a European Parliament perspective, right? So not from a football world perspective. But I think what we have to keep shifting back to is away from the economic question, but the social one, as you said before. I mean, there we seem to have to take football for granted, that it exists. I come from Malta. I mean, the amount of teams we have and the amount of leagues and rankings we have. But what would, I mean, I am really attached to my own town's football club. And it's a tiny one and is doing well now after decades of not doing so well. But I look at that from a sort of David and Goliath kind of thing, you know, that you grow up with the hope that maybe your tiny team will one day make it. And to those people in those 50 countries, Aki, that's what football is also. And it has to matter that in those huge 5-country clubs, you have people who come from countries who are part of those 50, who dreamt and made it. Now, how can we engage them not only from an economic perspective? In other words, when we look at them, we don't look at how much money they make or how are we going to try to let's say, stop them from doing what they're doing, but rather how can we get even more individuals who will manage, who will succeed in the world. And that's where it's part of, I think, all of our responsibility, whether we work in politics or in the sport, in order to make sure that what would have happened last week, and there's every risk that something similar will still happen. I mean, and I read somewhere that, you know, there will be a very sort of quiet agreement at some point, and there will be some sort of non-competitive formation. But what can we do to make sure that today's football is no longer taken for granted, ignored, or thought that it could always be as we always remember it, because there are big problems and we need to solve them. Otherwise, we end up with the mess we had last week.
Okay, Damien, your postbag's probably the largest of most of the MPs, given the subjects you cover, and also those committees must be the most streamed parliamentary committees in the UK, given the fan feeling. But let me ask you this, if you want to comment on that. But also, there's suddenly a bunch of hand-wringing. We had Oliver Dowden talking about legislation on Monday in Parliament. We had Boris Johnson talking about legislation, etc. But when we need to get to this point of crisis, if this was a direction of travel, you probably, like I said, you hear from fans probably more than anyone else in the House of Parliament. We've had the Blair government, we've now had the coalition, and now the Conservative government, all facing up to the same thing, but there hasn't been any legislation. And now suddenly, you know, the fire's raging and all the fire engines are going to try and douse out a fire that we knew was coming. Why was there not legislation before? And what will there be legislation, do you think?
Well, I think one of the reasons, you know, I've sat on committees, chaired committees that have recommended regulation, licensing systems, independent regulatory bodies to oversee the way clubs are run. And we made those recommendations because we think football clubs are community assets. And indeed, football grounds are already in UK law community assets. You know, someone can't just buy a club and close the club down and sell the ground. There are interventions to stop it. The reason I think people turn to their members of parliament when there's a problem with their club is they don't know who else to go to, because they suddenly find the league and the FA have got relatively little power to do very much here. When we had the recent failure of Bury Football Club, you see, well, the principal reason it failed was no one was enforcing the league's own rules, let alone getting into, should there be, you know, legislation to change ownership structures or anything else. If there'd just been an enforcement of the rules of that league, then in terms of how much that club could spend, the whole thing could have been avoided. So that's when politicians get drawn in, because people say, well, you know, why wasn't something done to stop this failure, this bad thing happening? And I think the debate around licensing and intervention is saying that the football clubs have a community, their community assets, their cultural assets. There should be some protections around them. Yes, they exist within a competitive framework. Someone has got the right to run a club well or badly, but nevertheless there are certain limitations on what you can do. Just as in broadcasting, we have a licensing regime which requires people to meet certain standards and be a fit and proper person, and to run their business within certain parameters. And I think in the past it's been very difficult to do that because the football authorities have resisted it. We're now in a position, I think, where for the FA and the Premier League and the Football League, we've seen something which is a threat to the football pyramid, a threat to the structure of the game. And actually, their lawyers will have realised last week it was a threat they were relatively powerless to do very much about. And therefore, I think the mood has changed, that actually we need to create certain rules which protect the integrity of the competition and the clubs as cultural assets. The other thing I would say is I think about the nature of understanding what the nature of competition in sport is as well. If someone is introducing a new format, is the principal purpose of that format, if it's a closed league, to take revenue from other people and put it in a walled garden which they control to enrich themselves to the detriment of everyone else? Or is it to promote and enhance competition? So in the case of European Super League, you could say, well, clearly the long-term process of this is to make this a vehicle through which these clubs get even wealthier, ultimately to the detriment of disturbing other competitions. Now, of course, there could be a situation where if you were taking football into a country where there was no established league and you wanted people to buy into teams and invest in teams over a 10 to 15-year period to give that league the chance of getting off the ground, then you might say, well, okay, there could be a case for that league starting as a closed league, so people make that investment, but in time it will open up. And therefore, the purpose of a closed league here is to develop competition rather than to diminish it. And I think that's how but I think we clearly need to rethink the way our competition law works in sport, because it doesn't work in that way at the moment. And the concern I would have had is that there wouldn't have been much that could have been done to stop it. And that's why I think Boris Johnson and Oliver Dowden started talking about legislation early last week, because I think they could see that it's possible the levers we thought were there to stop something like this happening, which could be seen as anti-competitive and to the detriment of the rest of football in England, that the law may not exist to stop that happening. And that's why, for me, we need to look at how competition law exists within sports, how you protect the integrity of competitions, and how you ensure there's independent oversight of the way clubs themselves are run. That I think is, that I think probably will require some form of legislation to put that in place, because the football authorities themselves do not have either the unity of opinion or strength to do it on their own.
Right. Both Miguel and Aki wanted to make a point. Miguel first, and then we'll go to Aki.
So just one point first on what Damien has said, I absolutely agree. But I think that to a large extent, that licensing process, for example, of clubs, probably will need to continue to be done in the UK case by the Premier League or the Football Association, or at European Union level by UEFA, for example. And that makes it necessary to in turn regulate UEFA too, for the reasons that I said. So we need regulation of clubs, but we need regulation also of football organizations. My view is not that we should somehow replace a lot of what UEFA and FIFA do at the moment, but instead we should create mechanisms to make them accountable and to make them respect certain fundamental principles in how they run their job as regulators, in how they run their job as competition organizers. That's what I think is important. Second issue, and it's related with this, and it's also with something Aki said. Aki stressed the need to which these new competition models of UEFA does improve somehow what smaller leagues get in 50 countries, but it doesn't resolve a fundamental problem that exists on the relationship between Champions League at the moment and the national leagues. The Champions League is aggravating exponentially competitive gap at the level of national leagues, creating serious problem there. We've seen that all the studies indicate that in the last 20 years, the competitiveness gap in the national leagues has increased exponentially, and it's easy to understand why. And it's particularly even more so the case in small and medium leagues, where at least one club gets to the Champions League. It's less the case on the smaller leagues, and it's less the case on the bigger leagues, where more clubs get to the Champions Leagues. But on the other leagues, the medium leagues, this bulk of leagues, what happens is very simple. You get one club that gets into the Champions League and gets a financial advantage that is huge with respect to all other clubs in the National League. This club then transforms that financial advantage into a competitive advantage. That's why you are even in bigger leagues. You see that now. Bayern Munich is going to win the league for the 9th consecutive time. Juventus has won the league for 8. In Portugal, the club that wins the league wins with the largest difference in points, biggest ever in time, with correspondence with the other teams now and in the past years. Why? Because you have these entrenched positions that reinforce themselves. You get to the Champions League, you get a huge financial advantage that you turn into a competitive advantage. You then get to win the championship again and again, and you simply go and reinforce. This needs to be addressed. I don't think UEFA is in a position to do it because it doesn't have the. I don't think that you can impose it from the outside, but you need to change the way UEFA regulates this by impose certain principles that try to reduce this extremely negative impact that is having on national leagues.
It may have a small window now. Aki, you wanted to make a.
Miguel, I actually disagree with you on that one, because you are talking about cap within the league, and in these leagues that somebody, for example, in our league, we are the one. So we invest, and the money comes from somewhere else. It comes from the player sales. It comes from doing things commercially sustainable and everything. Actually, I disagree with you, because we are the gap between the 5 biggest leagues and others. That's the gap that is growing. Just give you a few numbers. Us 50 other countries, we pay 440 million yearly to these big 5 leagues broadcasting rights. What we get in return, €0 from them. When we pay, these 50 countries pay 380 million euros to UEFA competitions, we get in return 820 million. So where I do understand regulation and commercial entity working, but at the moment, our customers and our people, they actually pay the big 5 leagues and get nothing. From UEFA, we get much more solidarity than we get from everywhere else. So if you try to correct the gap between the biggest club in your country to the others, I don't think that is the gap we need to come with. Because the reason why, when we now we are talking about the broadcasting rights, which is the base of the money. At the same time, which Roberta said before, is that local clubs are dying with the pace that never seen in football before, which means that the little boy doesn't go to play in his local park anymore because there's no club anymore. So he only learns to watch football from television. This is much more worrying. And this is worrying that we only learn to watch these big clubs from TV and we don't go to local park anymore. So in my opinion, we need to fix the gap between the 5 big leagues and the rest of the Europe.
It's like a social contract, Aki, that you're talking about between football, the national governments and the people. What is football element? Is it just an entertainment product that you flick your TV on and you watch the best teams play? And if that is what people want, perhaps that's the direction of travel. But what we haven't seen is any pushback from people who have power against any of these trends. Miguel, you wanted to make a quick point.
I just wanted to cite statistics. I mean, Aki, I understand your club is the one winning in Finland. You feel happy about it, but the statistics are very clear in all leagues of Europe. Okay, but you invest the most because you get more money. And let me give you an example. In Portugal, a team like Porto gets to the Champions League, gets 70 million euros from the Champions League this year. No other team in Portugal, with the exception of Benfica, has a total budget like that. So they get more from the Champions League than the other teams get in their overall budget. I mean, this is a huge, no matter how you paint it, this is a huge competitive advantage. It's 3, 4, 5 times the budget of any other team.
Miguel, what happens? They take the entrepreneurial risk, and sometimes it succeeds. Next year it doesn't. Portugal is actually a great example. One year it's Sporting, one year it's Porto, one year it's Benfica, and it's not because of the whatever money. Because some years these don't get the Champions League money, all of these. So it changes there year in year out. Who does the proper investments? Who does the proper management?
Is the difference? It's the difference between these 3 clubs and the rest. the Portuguese first team wins with 85% of the points. The rest of the matches no longer care. But anyway, we will not continue. I want to leave the other ones.
Maybe Miguel and Aki, you may have an after-hours discussion about this point. But there is something to be said about the distorting value of maybe some of the European UEFA's distribution on national leagues. I think it's a conversation worth having, and there are examples of this, especially in the smaller leagues. Aki, we could talk about that another time. But Damien, do you think like how this window that we have now, we've seen like the biggest of the big clubs take their arrows out of the quiver, fire them, and they've missed all their targets. They're kind of, for the first time in my memory, these guys are on their knees and their faces have been rubbed in the mud a little bit. This is a small window to get things done. What do you think can be done? And is it and how long is that window going to last in order to safeguard certain structures that maybe the rest of football wants? How soon and what can be done?
Well, I think I don't think we'll see another Super League proposal for another year or two. But I think there will either be at some point another big proposal like this, or they will try and achieve the same ends working through the existing structures, working through UEFA or others. And the idea of trying to create a sort of fenced-off league at the top, where all the wealthiest clubs play each other. The questions I think so within European sport, do we think that should be acceptable, that you can create these franchise leagues which make certain clubs very wealthy, and I mean that other clubs can create new tournaments or new formats or play amongst themselves, but they will also always be doing so at a lesser level, with no chance of rising to compete with those teams. As a principle, do we think we can legislate around that, and how should we do so that there's also guidance for people who create new competitions as to some basic principles underpin the way those competitions should be set up. I think there needs to be, looking at as football clubs as organisations, some independent scrutiny of how they are run, because they play this community function, and that the enforcement standards for that, either at UEFA level or a national federation level, are not strong enough and not independent enough to have the resources to do it properly. So I think, certainly domestically, I think that's the separate piece to say, how do you make sure that there is transparency over the financial performance and the decisions the club is being made to make sure the club is being run in a sustainable way. If the club ultimately is not, and is in breach of the rules, then what is the sanction? Do you have a golden share which can be kept for the community but taken away from the current owners? What is the sanction that you can apply? Should that be based in law? I think these conversations we're having around existing market distorting effects, looking at between the big leagues and other leagues and within leagues as well, is a function of the fact that the money for football generates money through television rather than through fans in stadiums. And we'd look at all sorts of things to try and correct that. So I'd imagine that in terms of the distribution of clubs like Champions League money to clubs like Porto, I'd imagine clubs like Porto would say, well, yeah, it is a lot, but actually we're competing against Liverpool. We're not just competing against Sporting. And actually Liverpool play in a league which is commercially much more successful than ours. So for us to have a chance of competing against them in the Champions League, we need to make sure our own revenues are strong as well.
Sorry, what's the vanishing point here? So if you take that, follow the logic, and you're dead right. Maybe if you follow it right to the end of the line here, maybe Real Madrid just play Bayern Munich every week, because you can follow that logic. Liverpool will say, well, we need more money so we can compete with Manchester United. Manchester United will say, we need more money, so it goes higher and higher, and you're just left with like two massive teams then just playing each other every week.
So I think what you've got to try and do is within the system build in things that at least that promote competition. So I think in the Premier League, yes, we're now in a position where the idea of a Nottingham Forest or Derby County or even Aston Villa winning the English League seems quite unlikely unless they had a massive injection of cash from somewhere else. But at least the redistribution model of TV revenue makes the league reasonably competitive. Lower teams in the bottom half of the league do beat teams in the top half of the league. There's some amount of competition there as well. So we're always going to have for various historic reasons, there'll probably always be some clubs that generate more interest and revenue than others. but at least they're being required to play in competitions that give others a fair crack at competing against them, to make it more enjoyable for people to watch and people to play in. And so I think it's not going to be perfect, but we need to build in those breaks that enhance and support competition by fairer distribution of revenue.
Right, and Roberta, some of these teams, I wouldn't say are too big to fail, but the history has shown they're too big to sanction. And I just want to ask you, I don't think there's any other kind of economic activity, any other industry, any sector where you have a governing body which is a competitor to the folks it's trying to regulate, be it the leagues or the clubs. So it's a regulator of them. It is a competitor to them for sponsorship and broadcast, and it also requires their acquiescence to play in their competition. For example, UEFA is around the world selling television rights to a competition like the Champions League. The reason why it's selling those is because it's saying, well, we got the best teams and the best players, Real Madrid, Manchester City, or whoever. Now, you would never sanction or remove any of your top assets from something you're selling in order to raise revenue. Is this fit for purpose? Can you have a something that is regulator, competitor, event organizer, and governing body for soccer in Europe, and FIFA at that level as well? Does it make sense? Is it fit for purpose today?
If I can just respond with a question. So, Aki, what you said before, UEFA is currently being like there are internal reviews, etc. Would this go into the direction of ensuring that things improve, or was that a different issue?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What you said, Aki, what you said, because I mean, okay, let me answer first, and then I'll go back to you, because you are right. Sorry, what we are talking about someone that is like so big to control, but it also controls itself and everybody who has anything to do with the organization. If you talk about UEFA on an EU level and FIFA on an international level, so if we are going to look into really trying to create a proper sanctioning system, in order to, we've been saying integrity of the game a lot, in order to make sure that when we talk about football, we don't only talk about the richest clubs with the richest players. When we're talking about what kind of payback can these big clubs give, right, to the communities that they ultimately trying to seek players from? How can you ensure that this power of incumbency, Miguel, we call that in politics, you know, the power of incumbency, that people are more automatically likely to vote for who they know rather than for someone new, and therefore it's so much more difficult to enter politics, in football sense. How are you going to ensure that those smaller clubs will one day at least have a chance, but more importantly, that they exist? So I think what I would answer to you, Tariq, and this is where my question to you, Aki, was, is that the reforms that are currently being done, would they go into a little bit in the way of ensuring that UEFA will have less control? Can UEFA, can we do something in order for UEFA not to have such control? Will we stop watching the games? Can we, for example, see what kind of deals, and this is something that we have looked into, deals with which television stations, rather than that would mean that the consumer needs to subscribe to particular channels and cannot watch them on the national television, of which everybody either pays or not. So these are agreements that we would need to look at, and we would have the tools actually to look at that, to see what you pay for, what you don't, how much money ultimately ends up being lost between the consumer and what would ultimately be the medium on which those games are shown. So I think that these are things from this 1 hour of chatting we would be able to look at. Very much looking forward to seeing what happens in Damien's committee, because that's legislation, as has been sort of announced by the Prime Minister, is something that I think would have to be done in many countries where the ownership of the clubs is not so clear, and where the rules of sanctions, or at least let's say how sanctions will be imposed, how you can appeal, or how they will be paid, is something that if we can't answer today, we need to find a way to find solutions for that. I think that's where our responsibility as political representatives comes in.
We're getting towards the end here, so short answers and short contributions.
Shortly answer. I'm pretty sure that Miguel and Damian is better to answer about the sanctioning and the regulator role. Just to confirm that the clubs and UEFA agreed about the changes and reforms that would be better for football and to everybody, especially the medium and smaller ones. And there was obviously something also for the biggest one, but as Florentino said in the interview over the weekend, it was just not enough. There was some of the controls was given to the clubs, but they went their own direction in any case.
We're coming towards it. Miguel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, two points. The first, I think, we need the right balance, and the right balance is that we do need to recognize the role that organizations such as UEFA and FIFA should continue to have in governing football, and that they should continue to have a broad scope. I don't think there is an alternative, an absolutely total alternative model whereby all these activities will start being regulated by states or the European Union. So I think they need to be, they need to continue to have a substantial degree needs to take place in certain things. That's and one more example of this interest. That is that think about the example that everybody's telling it of a club that didn't participate and is being praised for that, PSG, and the president of PSG. Do we know that he didn't embark on this because he really defends the model and all that, or he doesn't embark not only the president of PSG, but also sitting in the executive committee of UEFA and owns broadcasting rights Champions League. So in this case, he's both sitting on the regulatory body, he is competing, and he owns the broadcasting rights for the competition. I mean, so did he took the position he took because out of principle or out of a conflict of interest? We don't know. But so this demonstrates the extent to which you need to regulate that even to get rest. And finally, I think at the European Union level, this needs to be done by the EU via a very simple reason. Let's imagine that member states in the European Union will try to do legislation regulating questions regarding ownership of football clubs. This will immediately enter into conflict with the right of establishment and the freedom to provide some free movement of capital. So at the EU level, this will have to be done by the EU itself.
Right, we're coming to the very, very, very last few minutes of the last few comments. Actually, one quick one, very quick one for you. You mentioned these reforms. The new European format was agreed last week by UEFA in the middle of all of this. There was one big question hangs over this about access, 4 extra places in the Champions League, for example. This was bowing down to these big, powerful clubs. Do you now anticipate UEFA will say, well, you tried to break us. There is no way we're going to give these extra places to more powerful teams? Is it going to be going to leagues like yours, more national champions from smaller places? Quickly, please, Aki.
There's no format that my club will be in. For sure, we have to be much better on the pitch. But quickly, I think when something is agreed, where I come from, we honor the agreement. After speaking with UEFA and listening what they say in the media, obviously we need to evaluate and discuss some of the aspects probably again and take it from there. But there's obviously we're still learning what has happened and what is next, the best things to move together onwards in that. But obviously we are open to discuss on these subjects.
David, final comments, please.
Yeah, so just in general, I think the FIFA corruption scandal showed the problems of sports being run by regulators with no oversight of what they do. It shows you actually that the regulators themselves can be bad. What we saw with Super League was an attempt for the opposite, which is sports being run by the people that put the money in. Those being private clubs and enterprises, making decisions only focused on their own commercial interests and not anyone else's. What we need is something that I think recognises that sport is a massive global industry, but also one where there's massive for cultural and heritage reasons as well as sporting ones, massive community interest as well. And therefore, the role of intervention here has got to do 2 things. It's got to make sure there's proper independent scrutiny of the way decisions are made, but I think both by regulators and some transparency around that, as well as by the clubs themselves to make sure they cannot behave in a way that is, anti-competitive and distorting of the rest of competition. And I think we're now in a position where it is hard to see how this can be done without some sort of independent bodies with some statutory powers, or bodies with the ability to go in and audit and inspect what's going on and report back. Right. If they can be set up within existing bodies and be independent, great. If they have to be set up externally by the EU or national governments, then that's another way of doing it. But it's that sort of independent intervention to say, this governing body is being run in a way which is bad for the sport, and equally, these clubs are being run in a way which is potentially bad for the sport as well. And that intervention is absent, and that's been a problem in many ways for many years.
So bad plus bad equals independent regulator is what we're getting there. Roberta, last word from you.
You forgot who controls themselves in order to prevent from being controlled. So yes, bad. I mean, I think I can, and there are a lot of takeaways that I can take from this debate, and I really think, you made me realize that we should do more. We shouldn't just look at last week and say, look, all right, it didn't work out. We put enough pressure. They withdrew. I had the same question about PSG, actually, Miguel. I was wondering about what happened there. I was really thinking, like, why is there no French team there, knowing why the German teams were not there. So I think we can do more. And I will look about, not forgetting the integrity of the competition and remembering that sports should be treated, let's say, differently, and not just from an economic perspective, because it's about all of us. And that's what I will take with me from this discussion, and I'll definitely be trying to prod the people who can do something in this house in order for us to do something.
Robert, I understood you right that you are thinking about salary caps now. Thank you.
Happy 30 seconds.
Yeah, like the US ones. Yeah, I've been googling. Yeah, but I'm married to a Finnish, so I hold my word.
So I will tell the clubs that you promised salary caps as of next week.
No, I did not.
Okay, guys, I think we
think taxation instead.
We could
tax Ronaldo, but he shouldn't hear this.
We could talk about all of this for another 2 or 3 hours, guys. I mean, it just shows this conversation, the flow of it, the ideas, and the kind of need for change. It's quite an urgent discussion. It might seem only a kind of a frivolous activity, but you can see from the strength of feeling here and from millions of people around the world that this is, more than just a game and a piece of entertainment. So there's a lot of important work left to be done. Just want to thank, all 5 of you all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with me, all 4 of you for joining us today. And I'm sure there'll be many more discussions to be had, and hopefully, as far as many fans are concerned, some legislative action from people like you, Damien, and people like you, Roberta. So thanks to everyone for listening. Thanks again to you guys for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.